he was slated for last month, but it ended up being his birthday. So we postponed to this month, but he's going to talk about some of his experience with a bunch of different frameworks and how that's informed his take on Rails. So Tim, I thank you very much for coming and talking, and take it away.
And is recording okay, Tim?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Great. All right, take it away.
So interestingly, Dan, on my birthday, there was a production outage for the side project I was working on, and that was not a fun birthday present. I'll just say that. So I'm going to share a little bit of my journey. I hope you can see my screen here. Yes, good. Okay. So I'm using my computer and my phone at the same time, which is confusing me, but hopefully it doesn't confuse you all. So my name's Tim Kleier, and I've been doing software development for a little over 10 years. I started with Ruby on Rails, probably like most people, having no clue what they were doing, right? You got to solve a problem. You try to solve that problem, and Ruby on Rails is great for spinning up web applications, as we all know. It's great for making a mess if you want to try your hand at software development, but it can solve problems really quickly. So I started by solving a real world problem of trying to manage finances for 400 teachers overseas. And what that looked like essentially is these spreadsheets that we were taking these spreadsheets that had financial numbers on them, and then we would export PDFs and send them to 400 different email addresses. And as you can imagine, it took 8 to 10 hours every time we did it, once a month. So it was things like that in this small nonprofit that I was working for, where we said, hey, we've got to have a better solution to this. We looked at creating an application for it, and the cost was exorbitant, and we decided to do it in-house. In other words, I basically said to our IT director, hey, let's learn this, let's figure this out. And that's what got me started in Ruby on Rails. And what you see there is this journey that started with Ruby, started with Rails, it started with SQL Server, Apache, and then it journeyed all the way through to my recent position was working with Node, Node Express, and a few other technologies. But the path to get there, really, I think it highlights a lot of pretty substantial things in terms of skill development, but also in terms of character development. So I'll just share some snippets along the way. And then I'd love to actually, in our question and answer time, but if you have questions for me, that's great. But I'd love to actually engage this community in asking about, well, what things have you learned as you've jumped stacks, as you've hacked stacks, if you will. What have you learned skill-wise, but also in terms of character development? So I mentioned the beginnings of my Ruby on Rails development, which Elise, I think you sort of alluded to this. You might figure out something, and then a few days later, a few weeks later, months later, you're like, hey, how did I do that again? So I think every developer knows that Google is their best friend, so I should have put Google in here somewhere. Google, Stack Overflow, Reddit, all those things are incredibly valuable. But I spent a lot of my first, I'd say 3 years, having no idea what I was doing, slapping together stuff, not being able to really see the magic or behind the magic in Ruby on Rails. And so I always felt like, hey, I'm just going to perpetually be this junior developer because I can't figure out Rails. It's like if I want to dig deeper into it, I'm just not going to be able to figure it out. And that's not true for Ruby on Rails as a framework or technology, but that's the way I felt. And I do want to pause real quick and just talk about the difference between a framework and a stack here. So we're talking about hacking stacks. And Ruby on Rails is a framework. Ruby is the language that's paired with Rails as a framework. And a stack would extend also into So the server technologies, the database technologies as well. And if you, let's say, bring in React, some people, I think this was on Stack Overflow developer survey, I think they called React a framework, which, framework library, whatever, we don't need to argue about that. But if you layer all those technologies together, you end up with your stack. So my stack started with all those red logos there and color coordinated. I was not intentional in that, but it looks pretty, doesn't it? That flow. I realized at the company that I was at, I realized that the bus number was 1 in terms of if I got hit by a bus, there would be nobody else who could take over my work and actually be successful in the nonprofit, the small nonprofit we were in. So I realized when that was happening, at the same time I was frustrated with my job, is just too much work, too much pressure, that I needed to move on, that the organization needed me to move on. And thankfully I had a friend working at Colorado State University who took me on and said, hey, can you come develop mobile applications, and not just mobile applications for us, but can you make a template? Because we want to take this and duplicate it over here, here, here. So I'd never done mobile development. And I got thrown into Xamarin and then .NET. Xamarin utilizes .NET, but then also we built an API that was in .NET. Use Windows, obviously, Postgres with that. And so I had the challenge of trying to make a cross-platform mobile application template for other mobile apps. And it was incredibly challenging, but I learned a ton. And part of what I learned is that I can go from web to mobile, from Apache to Windows Server, from SQL Server to, I did a little bit of MongoDB in there too, but to go over to Postgres. And I could learn C#. I could learn a strongly typed language. So that was only about 9 months, actually. And then I switched back to Ruby on Rails for a little while. Then I ended up in the end of the journey that you see there, at least on the image, is Node, Express. We were primarily using Macs, but we were also in AWS. I could have popped AWS up there. And that was enterprise. So I went from a really small nonprofit through a university setting to an enterprise, like top agricultural retail company. So tons of diversity, just crazy, so painful. The journey was so painful because I had to face my fear and imposter syndrome 25,000 times in that. And what I want to say about, obviously that we can talk about the stacks and how the stacks compare. What are the strengths and weaknesses of each? But I feel like it's rare that we actually talk about the personal aspects, the character development. If someone were to look at my resume, they might say, hey, this person is distinctive because they have experience across these stacks. They might say they've got versatility there. Maybe also perspective, like, hey, Node and Express, we're not using any framework, so this is just vanilla. So we have to create routers and controllers and all sorts of things. We got to create everything. And what would I do? Well, first thing I think about is, how does Rails do it? Really strong conventions, but not to assume that Rails is going to do it perfectly. So there are places, I think, where it developed my technical skills to where now I'm an architect and I get to design systems and really, let's say, groupings of stacks together. But I think it made me, I'm not going to say fearless, but it gave me fortitude. And I guess what I mean by that is that when an architect at my previous job said to me, we were talking in a JavaScript context, and he said, well, that team over there, we need something from them. And I was like, well, we're not just going to go modify their code base or look at the code necessarily. He's like, well, yeah, we can. And it was in C# and .NET. And he said, it's just code. And I was offended at the time. I was like, no, it's not just code. I mean, I know Ruby on Rails, and that's all I know. But when he said it was just code, it kind of gave me the freedom to say, well, I guess I can learn that. I can become versatile enough. You know, my goal is not to become a Ruby expert. My goal is to learn any language and be able to function in any programming language. So I'm going to actually pause there, and I'd love to sort of turn this around and ask questions of you. I'm going to start just by asking you guys questions, and then you can sprinkle in questions for me as you want. But for those of you who have experience across different web and or mobile stacks, what are places of character development for you and or skill development?
I can chime in actually. For me, one of the things that I've slowly come to the realization of after working across a couple of different types of stacks and a couple of different types of industries is that it's okay to not be the best at everything. And it's actually okay to say, is this the best use of my time to learn about CSS, or is it better to ask someone else on my team who is better at it, might enjoy it better, to do the thing? And you know, the answer may be yes or no depending on their speed. I can still make progress, but that's a hard thing for me because I tend to want to think I can kind of work across everything. Yep. But I'm not going to be the best at everything by definition. And so that to me is something that I'm still kind of working through personally.
Yeah, I like that. It's strategic thinking, and it's also, I think it's a mark of leadership, Dan, that you're able to say, I could learn this, but it's going to take me 2 or 3 times as long as if I just tap this person over here who does know it, or you're just evaluating what is the best approach. I think that's, and it's a mark of maturity. So for others too, and I can call on you if if people don't chime in. But thanks, Dan, for sharing that.
And I think chime in there. Sorry if I just talked over somebody. Just sort of like getting rid of the ego a little bit and being like, hey, I don't know this or I forgot it. Let's like pair or work through this together. Instead of being like, I got to do this all on my own. It's been really helpful for me.
Yeah.
A lot of times the solutions are better when I work with somebody.
I've worked in like a bunch of different stuff. Like I primarily do Ruby and Rails now, but in the past, I've done app development. I've done ops related stuff. I've done embedded, like robotics related things. So like kind of all over the place. And I think like one of the biggest things is that when you switch, like some of those are really just like embedded, and robotics is like totally different from web, right? But like one of the things that I've kind of learned in my career is that sometimes it's like you're struggling with something and like maybe it's just like not the right time, right? Like I've had things in my career where I struggled really hard and then I just like later was able to get it very easily, or like concepts even. So even just sort of realizing that you don't have to, kind of to what Dan said, you don't have to like know everything right now, all by yourself.
Yeah, and I think it's reasonable to expect if you're jumping to a stack that's very different, then I think you should expect that it's going to take months maybe to become decent at it. And then to be proficient, it could take a couple years, and that's okay, right? You mentioned robotics, and sometimes it was easier for you and other times it was more difficult. Was there anything that was that caused that difference? Like why was it easier for you sometimes to jump from this technology to that one, and why was it more difficult sometimes?
So I think particularly going from doing kind of Rails and some .NET stuff to doing embedded, there were some things, like the things that were easier were programming things. Like that change actually taught me a lot about how similar programming is, like sort of to what you said about it's just code. Like programming is very similar at varying scales, right? But the things that were different is that in an embedded environment, like in a server environment, you have infinite RAM, right? Like you don't have to really think about it. But like for embedded stuff, there was a lot of times where I would just be struggling with data structures, trying to get something to like, that would do what we needed it to do in this small memory footprint that we had on the chip that we were using. So, and a lot of those things were kind of more advanced, like, and you're also using C, like not a nice language, like Ruby, you're using this really like, is terse the right word? Language that's just like, yeah, so I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I think there are things across programming languages, frameworks that are very similar. Some are different. So Cake PHP, it has MVC, and it's like embedded Ruby. So that was very comfortable for me. But trying to deal with the differences in the views between, let's say, HTML and CSS and web, and then doing that in mobile, you just kind of have to think a little bit differently. But I imagine your experience with the embedded stuff it's even a bigger jump in some ways, and maybe there's a lot of similarities too. Yeah. Any others? And by the way, Dan or Rylan, feel free to move us on whenever. But
I think anytime throughout my career, I've usually switched between a stack, be it like .NET to Node or something like that, is make sure you have fun with it when you do the switch. So I'll ask my wife, like, hey, what's a dumb little app that we need in the house? Like, oh, I need a companion app for Game of Thrones or something like that. And making sure that when you're like learning that new stack, if it's Angular, if it's Mean or something, you're having fun with it. And for me, it's building something silly, basically. Always kind of keeps it fun and keeps it light.
I like that. Can you share one or two apps that you've one or two silly apps that you've created?
Oh, my favorite one is, if everyone's heard of the show The Bachelor. So my wife asked me a while ago of like, hey, I need a way to track the contestants that are left on The Bachelor, and I need to find a way that I can eliminate them as they go. And I've had so much fun with this thing over the years. It started in like .NET 3, I think, and then I went to Core, and then I went to Mean with it, and I made it a PWA, and I made it hooked to Firebase at one point, and I just had a lot of fun transitioning it over the years for different technologies. So
that's awesome.
That might be my favorite one.
Recycling there, huh?
Exactly. Just keep recreating it, new stack.
That's good.
So actually, Tim, we probably should give everyone kind of a 5-minute break. And then I see we have all three of our panelists on. So thank you, Tim, for kind of bringing in that contemplative aspect, which I think, like you said, the character development of software development is something that we have not, we always focus on technical skills, right? Even in job descriptions, like they'll put in like the team player and like hard worker, but like you don't really dig into like what it means to go through some of this difficulty. So thank you.
Yeah, sure.
I appreciate it. Cool. All right, so let's convene back here in 5 minutes, which by my clock is like 7:02, and we'll get going with the panel.